Welcome to the West Virginia Media Lab podcast. We are diving into something pretty fascinating today. We're talking about inventors from West Virginia. You don't always hear about them, but they've made some huge contributions.
Right. You think of invention, and maybe Silicon Valley pops into your head, or like big city labs.
Exactly.
But this material we're looking at really flips the script. You start to see how innovation can sprout up anywhere, especially when folks have that drive to solve problems.
Necessity is the mother of invention, as they say.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's start with Granville T. Woods. He's been called, and this is interesting, the Black Edison. That alone tells you a lot.
Yeah, that nickname is loaded for sure.
And he had a really strong connection to Huntington, West Virginia.
Right.
That's where a lot of his big work took place. What's the story there?
So get this, while he was in Huntington, he developed this thing called the induction telegraph system.
Yep.
Now, this was absolutely massive for railway safety. We're talking late 19th century, right? Trains are becoming a bigger and bigger deal. But how do they communicate? Well, before Woods, they couldn't really. Not while moving anyway.
I see. So he basically made it possible for trains to talk to each other while they were on the move.
Exactly. It was all about using these electromagnetic fields, super innovative for the time, and it meant they could coordinate better, avoid accidents. Imagine what that meant for public transportation.
Oh, that's huge. Especially back then when rail travel was still pretty new and I imagine kind of dangerous. And speaking of Edison, one of the sources actually mentions how Edison tried to take credit for Wood's work.
Yeah, it's a shame, but it also, I think, underscores a lot of the hurdles that inventors faced, especially, inventors from marginalized communities.
Yeah, absolutely. So going back to Huntington for a second, was there something about that place in particular that made it a good spot for Woods to invent things?
Well, think about Huntington back then. It was a major railway hub, right? So Woods is right there. He's seeing the dangers of train travel firsthand. He's probably interacting with the people working on the railways, seeing the need for better communication.
He's got a front row seat.
Exactly. And maybe even access to the kind of resources and infrastructure he needs to actually build and test his ideas. It's like all the pieces came together there in Huntington.
Okay, that makes sense. So let's move on to another inventor. This one is Elsie Henderson from Charleston. And her invention is, well, it might seem a little less world-changing compared to a railway communication system.
Yeah, but still incredibly impactful in its own way.
So what did she create?
A reusable coffee filter system.
Okay.
And it's the context that makes this one really stand out. This is the early 20th century, right? And, women back then often couldn't even open their own bank accounts. But Elsie Henderson, a housewife, gets a patent and starts selling her invention locally. Talk about gumption and entrepreneurial spirit. And if you think about it, this predates a lot of the disposable paper filters we're used to today. So it was potentially even a more sustainable option back then.
Right. It's like practicality meets resourcefulness.
Definitely.
It really makes you think about what people were able to achieve even with the limitations they faced. Okay, so moving on, we have to talk about another Howard Hughes. This one is from Beckley.
Okay, yeah, this Howard Hughes was quite different from the famous aviator and filmmaker.
Right, not the Hollywood type. This Hughes had a much more hands-on background.
Yeah, he was a coal miner, and his invention came directly from the dangers of that work. In the 1930s, he created an early version of a flame-resistant mining suit.
That's pretty incredible, especially considering how dangerous coal mining was.
It really was.
Yeah.
And the sources emphasized that it wasn't about fame for him. He didn't get a bunch of headlines or anything. It was really about survival, about making the work safer for himself and his fellow miners.
I can just imagine him working on this in his spare time, trying to make things better.
Yeah, the material even mentions how he developed it right there at his kitchen table, just using basic materials he had on hand. It's like the ultimate example of problem solving, born out of necessity.
It's so inspiring. It makes you realize that even today, there are probably so many people out there who are quietly inventing things, solving problems, and maybe not getting recognition for it.
Totally. And it speaks volumes about a culture where people don't just sit around and wait for solutions. They get out there and create them themselves.
Okay, so next up we have Lewis Latimer. He's a pretty important figure in the history of the light bulb.
Oh, absolutely. His story is really fascinating. Now, he worked directly with Edison and Bell, major players. He made some big improvements to the light bulb filament, the part that actually lights up. He figured out how to make it last longer and burn brighter.
So he basically made the light bulb way more practical.
Exactly. And what's interesting for us is that he spent some really important years in Wheeling, West Virginia, studying mechanics.
So his connection to West Virginia is through those formative years, the time when he was really learning his craft.
Exactly. The material even says, and I love this quote, "No light bulb burns bright without Latimer's genius." It really highlights how essential his contributions were, even though they're often overlooked.
It's a good reminder to look beyond the big names and see who else was involved, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
It's like every invention has this whole network of people behind it.
Yeah.
And Latimer, with his roots in West Virginia, is a perfect example of that.
Okay, so finally, we can't talk about West Virginia inventors without mentioning Katherine Johnson. Her story is probably the most well-known, thanks in part to the movie Hidden Figures.
Oh, Hidden Figures. Such a great film. But even before the movie, her story was pretty incredible.
So let's remind people about her connection to West Virginia.
Well, she was born and raised in White Sulphur Springs, and her story really challenges the notion that brilliance only comes from, fancy schools or big cities.
Right.
I mean, she calculated trajectories for NASA missions, for the Apollo program. This woman was brilliant. And the material really drives home this point. Her brain power, her talent, it didn't come from some elite coastal academy. It came from a segregated school in the mountains.
It's a pretty powerful statement about the potential that exists everywhere.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that talent doesn't discriminate, and that sometimes the most groundbreaking ideas come from the places we least expect.
So thinking about all these inventors, all from West Virginia, we see a common thread emerging, right? This kind of spirit of innovation that seems really unique to the state.
It's undeniable. The sources keep coming back to this idea of resourcefulness, this grit, getting the job done with whatever you've got.
It's like that classic image of someone tinkering in their garage and coming up with something amazing.
Exactly. And there's this great line from one of the sources, "Innovation wasn't a buzzword, it was breakfast." I love that.
It perfectly captures that feeling of practicality, like you don't just talk about innovation, you live it.
Exactly. It's woven into the culture.
So before we wrap up, I wanted to ask you, what do you think is the biggest takeaway from all these stories? Why should people care about these forgotten inventors?
Well, for me, it's a reminder that creativity and intelligence aren't limited by geography. We often have these preconceived notions about where great ideas come from. But these stories show us that the next big thing could come from anywhere, from a small town in West Virginia, from a farm, from a workshop.
So we should all be paying more attention to what's happening in our own communities.
Exactly. And maybe even thinking about how we can foster that spirit of innovation and encourage the next generation of inventors, no matter where they come from.
That's a great point. It's like we need to be looking for potential everywhere, not just in the places we expect to find it.
Yes.
Well, this has been a really eye-opening conversation. Thanks for sharing all this with us. And to our listeners, we hope this has inspired you to think differently about where innovation comes from.
And maybe even do a little digging into the history of your own community. You never know what you might find.
Thanks for joining us on the West Virginia Media Lab podcast. We'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to today's podcast. The West Virginia Media Lab is all about celebrating our state and its people, businesses, stories, news, and folklore. If you love West Virginia like we do, be sure to comment below, then subscribe, like, and hit the notification bell to stay connected. Until next time, stay wild, wonderful, West Virginia.